Hey guys, what's going on? Welcome back to my channel. So in today's video, we're not just going to do another how to propagate your houseplant video, but we're actually going to cover something I've been wanting to do for a while now, which is filming this post-propagation process after planting your cuttings video. And after a few months of putting it on hold, I finally am checking off my to-do list, and I can thank Moosehead for that encouragement and that push. As some of you guys know, I partnered up with this awesome Canadian brewery, Moosehead, which is Canada's largest brewery, still owned by Canadians. And this summer, they're on a mission to help you or help me get things done, especially when it comes to your plant babies, whether that is, repotting your houseplant, maybe propagating houseplants, or transitioning them out of your prop box and eventually growing them into full potted plants. Whatever the plant work is, we're here to help you get it done and earn a beer with your name on it. Like seriously. They sent me a beer with my name on it, huh? How cool is that? So once you complete a task you're proud of, and it could even be the one I'm gonna show you, simply take a photo of it, post it on Instagram, and tag at Moosehead by the end of the summer for your chance to earn a beer with your name on it. I'm gonna post a link in the description box for more information about how you can earn a beer with your name on it. So to help you guys get things done when it comes to your plant babies, I asked some of you on Instagram, what is the task you've been wanting to do or been putting off? And a lot of you guys have requested for a video on all things propagation and how to care for your plants after propagation, so a post-care video. And that is what we're gonna cover today. Most of you know that propagating houseplants is one of the best ways to grow your plant collection, but caring for recently planted cuttings can sometimes be a bit tricky or even discouraging, especially if in the past you've experienced some rotting or your cuttings dying after you planted them. So in today's video, I'm gonna try and cover the post-care propagation process, so everything from when to water them, how much should you water, should you give humidity, should you do fertilizer, or when to do pest prevention and all of that stuff. So before we get started, if this is a video you'd like to see, make sure you give it a thumbs up and also comment below and let me know which plants you're currently propagating today. So without further ado, we'll get this video started. I'm actually gonna move over to the back area so that way you guys can see what I'm working on. Let's go. All right, guys, so before we get into how to care for your recently propagated or planted cuttings, let's quickly review the different methods on how you can propagate certain houseplants. Now, the first method I'm going to show you guys is, one of my favorites is because it's the first one I actually learned, which is the water method. And all you really need is just pretty much like a jar. You can use either like a mason jar or even like these little propagation stations that you can find on Amazon. And obviously some water and then your cuttings. The best kind of plants to really cut up and propagate through the water methods are your vining plants like a pothos, or even a climbing plant like a monstera or a philodendron. So what you want to do is you actually want to take your plant, your mother plant, and you want to find a node and you want to cut below the node. Now the node is the area where a leaf and an aerial root or roots will eventually grow, or even a growth point. So in this case, you guys can see where the pothos node is. It's right here. So what you want to do is you just want to cut below that. So we're going to take this neon pothos and we're just going to cut below the node. You guys can see right there. Snip it. And there is your cutting that you want to place in water. So once you have your cuttings in a propagation station, you want to place it in an area that gets a lot of bright indirect light, but more importantly, some warm temperature. So I like to put mine, as close to the window as possible without getting any direct sunlight, and obviously just making sure that the temperature is right for it. So within a few weeks, you should start to see some roots grow out of that node. And you guys can see some cuttings I already have here propagating in water. This global green pothos has a few little roots growing out of it. This philodendron melanochrysum. And then I got some Scindapsus exotica here and a Syngonium albo. So a couple of tips when it comes to propagating using the water method, and to ensure that your cuttings don't end up rotting, or if there are roots starting to grow, that they don't rot. Tip number one is let that cutting air out a bit, so that way it's not a fresh wound that will go in water and bacteria potentially gets in there and eventually will start to rot. I typically don't have a problem when I cut my cuttings and place in water right away, but some people do, so maybe just let it air out a bit. And then the other tip is you want to make sure that you are constantly changing the water or topping it up like every other day or every 3 days, just to make sure that that water is not in a standstill mode. Again, standstill water creates algae, gets dirty, and potential bacteria gets in there. So you want to just make sure that you are changing the water frequently or topping it up. So those are kind of the couple tips I like to give when it comes to propagating in water, just making sure that those cuttings do not rot, because once you have a fully developed roots, and the question I often get is, when are you able to then transplant it from water over to your potting medium of choice? So I typically like to allow or wait till the roots is at least 2 inches long, and sometimes even multiple roots. So for example, on this Syngonium albo, you guys can see how long these roots are right now. So this is probably, I would say, like even a foot long, and it's got a couple smaller ones on some of those nodes already. So this is what you want to see. And I've had this in water for a while. So this is pretty much ready to be transplanted into a potting medium. And what I like to typically do when it comes to planting a cutting into a potting medium is I want to make sure that the pot I'm going to use isn't going to be too big. It's because these roots are still small, so you want to make sure that it's not going to be drowned by a lot of soil. So I'm going to use this like 2.5 inch, or I think this is a 3.5, no, this is a 2.5 pot, and I'm going to use an airy potting mix. So pretty much I'm just going to use equal parts of like cacti soil, potting soil, perlite, and then maybe a bit of cocoa husk or cocoa chips. And I'm just going to, place a layer of soil in there, and then I'm going to put my cutting, trying to, get those roots to, sit evenly throughout the pot. And yeah, once it's sitting nicely there, I'm just gonna top it up with more soil, and this guy should be ready to go. So once you plant your cutting, what you want to do is give it a good drain. And a lot of people get confused with this, should you water your plant after planting it in soil? Yes, you should. You want to allow those roots to merge with the soil. And because your cutting was, propagated in water, it's used to getting a lot of that moisture and a lot of that water. And if your potting soil is well draining, you shouldn't worry so much about, potentially overwatering this plant. So definitely water your plant after, potting it up in soil. So here's a few other plants I propagated in water. Another Syngonium albo, and you guys can see it's already potted up in its potting medium, and there's already a new leaf growing and even a couple of aerial roots, so looking pretty good. And I also have this Monstera escaleto. This was also a top cutting. I cut the top off, rooted in water, and you guys can see it's growing really nicely, has a new leaf ready to unfurl there, and even has a couple of aerial roots. So you guys can see how easy it is to propagate houseplants using the water method. The other method I like to use is actually a propagation box, and this is great for a lot of mid-cuts or wet sticks. Now a mid-cut is the area after the top cutting. So if you guys recall, we cut the neon pothos, which is the top cutting. And then any cutting after that, so it's right here, you guys can see, would be considered a mid-cut. So for example, if we were to cut the next node or next below that node, right here, so you guys can see, right this is what we would call a mid-cut. And if there was no leaf on this guy, or it was just a runner, we'd consider that like a wet stick. And you guys can see here, I got a lot of wet sticks from my Monstera escaleto that just ran off. So I ended up cutting it and making wet sticks. So what you're gonna need is a propagation box. You guys can use like, Tupperware or even like old salad containers. But I use these bins that I get from the dollar store, and you wanna make sure it has a nice lid that will trap a lot of the moisture when it comes to your propagation box. And then you're gonna need some sphagnum moss or perlite. I personally like to use sphagnum moss. I've been so comfortable with it. I've tried perlite a bit, but I haven't had much success when it comes to my wet sticks or my mid cuts. So for me, sphagnum moss is the way to go. And you wanna make sure that your sphagnum moss is nice and wet. Not soaking wet, but wet enough to make sure it retains a bit of the moisture and the water. And if you were to wring it out, there'll be water, draining through it. So that's just gonna help create humidity and moisture in your prop box in order for those wet sticks to develop roots and eventually grow a new growth point and turn into a plant. So what you wanna do with your prop box is lay a layer of sphagnum moss, at least maybe about like 1 inch or 1.5 inches, on the bottom of that prop box evenly. And then you want to start placing your cuttings or your wet sticks where the node is facing down towards the sphagnum moss. So that way the roots will grow into the sphagnum moss and makes it a little easier for you to then grab that wet cutting if you were to then move it to a little pot with its own sphagnum moss or eventually into your preferred potting medium. Close the lid and then place it in an area that gets a lot of bright indirect light and warm temperatures. In fact, temperature is probably more important than lighting when it comes to your prop box, and that's because you want condensation to take place in your prop box in order for it to work, which is actually my #1 tip in making sure that your wet sticks and your mid cuts do not rot in your prop box is just make sure there's condensation happening, because that tells you water is moving within the prop box. If there's no condensation taking place, you are gonna risk rotting a lot of your wet sticks or your mid cuts. Another tip is to open the prop box once in a while, just to allow some airflow. But I actually hardly open up my prop box, only because I know when there's condensation taking place, it's working. But it's still good practice to open it, every few days. Again, just to check in on those cuttings, making sure that nothing is rotting and so on. So similar to the water method, within a few weeks, you should start to see some, baby roots growing, and even in some cases, new growth point. So you guys can see here, this is one of the Scindapsus jade satin, and there's already roots clinging onto the moss. I even got a couple here, mid cuts, and you guys can see there's little roots. And then here with some of the Monstera escaleta, you guys can already see a bit of the growth point that's taking place out of that node, and then roots growing on the other sides. I get really excited whenever I see like a wet stick start to show some growth point, because eventually that growth point is going to be like the main vine, and then that's what's going to be your new plant. So really cool. Question I get is, when should you transplant your cuttings out of the prop box into its own little pot or its own potting medium? So there's a couple ways you can do this. Similar to the water method, once you have at least 2 inches of roots grown, you can easily move this to your preferred potting medium. Again, making sure you're not using too big of a pot. Or sometimes what I like to do, even if the root system isn't as big, like for example this guy right here, you can see the Scindapsus, very, very tiny, maybe ½ an inch roots, is I'll actually just plant this directly into sphagnum moss, its own little pot, and then put it back in the prop box to continue to further develop and so on. So let's take this Scindapsus mid-cut as an example. So we do got a bit of roots there, and I'm gonna use this little like solo shot cup, and we're gonna use the same sphagnum moss that we have in the prop box, and pretty much just stick this guy in there. And then what I want to do after this is actually put it back in the prop box, just to make sure that that roots continue to develop and grow within the sphagnum moss. And then from there, once you have enough roots, that's more than 2 inches, you can then move it into its own little potting medium. I typically like my jade satin Scindapsus on an airy soil mix. Again, equal parts of perlite, cacti soil, and potting soil. So a few more plants that I threw in the prop box and eventually moved into its own little pot is this Hoya. I think this is the mermaid Hoya. You guys can see it's growing really nicely, and even this Hoya sunrise right here. But yeah, so those are a few plants that I like to throw into a prop box. Again, it's great for wet sticks and mid cuts, philodendrons, a lot of Hoyas. I also like to throw in there. Even some, pothos. I sometimes will throw a whole bunch just to make room. Scindapsus for sure I like to do in the prop box as well. Now let's touch a bit on the care when it comes to your recently planted cuttings, and making sure that they'll grow and develop into one day a full, mature plant. So first thing is lighting. So you want to make sure you're giving your little baby plants or plantlets similar lighting as the mother plant. So for example, if your pothos was getting bright indirect light, you want to make sure that that plantlet is getting similar lighting of bright indirect light. Now, when it comes to watering, this is where I think a lot of people lose some of their cuttings, especially once they recently planted, is if you're the type of plant parent who tends to underwater your plant, for example, I like to underwater my neon pothos and even my monsteras and even a few philodendrons. When it comes to the plantlet version of it, you don't want to do that. You want to make sure that you are, still allowing the soil to dry a bit, but not completely, where it will dehydrate and dry out pretty fast. Because I find that when it comes to your little plantlets, they're not as forgiving when it comes to underwatering, but they may be a little bit more forgiving when it comes to slightly overwatering, especially if a lot of those plantlets were grown in the water method or propagated in the water method. With the Syngonium albo, I'll typically allow it to dry out maybe like 60% or even 70% before I water it. The mother plant, I'll actually do about like 95 to 100% before I water that Syngonium. So that is what you want to just keep in mind when it comes to watering your little plantlets, is just don't allow it to dry out completely. And if you are going to let it dry out completely, don't let it sit in dry soil for long periods of time, because you will risk losing that plant. Now let's touch a little bit on humidity. So it really does depend on the plant, because some plants are humidity loving plants. Like I find anthuriums, certain alocasias, prayer plants. While other plants aren't necessarily humidity loving plants. So for example, the Syngonium albo, they typically are okay on like regular room humidity levels. So I would give my plantlets similar, humidity level. However, if you have a plant that normally doesn't require high humidity, but it was grown in a prop box, you still want to slowly acclimate it to that, regular humidity level. So what I typically will do is, for example, with the Scindapsus, we grew this in a prop box, we got its root there. Again, once I transplant it into moss or even into soil, I'll actually still leave it in a prop box for like a day or two, and then slowly then start, giving them a few hours outside the prop box, maybe move them to a greenhouse where it typically doesn't have super high humidity, because that prop box is probably like 100%, humidity level. So you want to slowly transition them off of that kind of humidity, because if you do it right away, you'll find that your plant is it's gonna wilt, it's gonna look sad, and you're gonna think, hey, it probably needs moisture, probably needs water, you're gonna probably overwater it, and so on. So you want to just keep that in mind, is that any plant that you do grow in a prop box, once you transplant it out of the prop box, you just want to slowly, deacclimate it or acclimate it into, a non-humidity loving environment. So that's definitely something you want to keep in mind when it comes to the humidity. Now, pest prevention. So regardless whether you have a mother plant or a plantlet, you want to make sure you have a pest prevention regime or process in place to ensure that your plants are going to be healthy. However, when it comes to your little plantlets or baby plants, they are quite prone to getting a lot of pests. So you want to be very diligent in making sure that you are spraying down your plants, every other week or every week, and just inspecting them and making sure that there are no pests. Because once pests gets in your plantlets, they're not as mature to be able to fight off a lot of those, invasive pests, and they can quickly and easily kill your plants. So I typically like to use this end-all spray, which is part of my preventative process, and I'll spray down my plantlets as well as the mother plants, every other week. Just making sure that, pests do not get in any of the plants. When it comes to fertilizer, you normally want to fertilize, when your houseplants are growing and thriving, which is during the growing season. However, when it comes to plantlets, I typically will not fertilize them. However, in the rare occasions that I do, I will make sure I use like a liquid fertilizer that I dilute even further than what the instruction says. So you want to read the instructions, and that's typically great for like a mother plant or a mature plant. And then you want to dilute it further, because you don't want to risk like overdoing it and potentially burning the leaves of your little plantlets. So just keep that in mind when it comes to the fertilizer. And eventually, this plant is going to outgrow this little pot and this little container, which are going to grow out of it. And then from that point on, you can then start to repot. And I guess by that time, it'll be like, it won't be considered a plant anymore. And potentially it might be a mother plant, because you might take some more cuttings out of it and repeat the process. But that's pretty much it when it comes to the post-care of your plantlets or your recently planted cuttings. So there you have it. Hopefully you found this video helpful when it comes to propagating and caring for your houseplants. Maybe even the inspiration for you to try it on your own and get her done. And let's face it, Moosehead is a beer made for those who get things done. And without all of you, I would have not gotten this video done. So this one is for you. Now it's your turn, Canada. What's gonna earn you a beer with your name on it? Once you complete that task, be sure to post it on Instagram and tag @Moosehead, but also tag me @CrazyPlantGuy, so that way I can see what you guys have been putting off and that you completed, because I'm looking forward to it when it comes to your plant babies. Other than that, hopefully you enjoyed this video, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.